Welcome. My name is Geneviève Zabriskie. I'm Associate Professor of Sociology and Director of the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia. And today I have the pleasure to introduce Kira Thurman, who's Assistant Professor of German and History here at the University of Michigan. She's also currently a faculty fellow at the Eisenberg Institute for Historical Studies. Kira earned her PhD in history from the University of Rochester in 2013, where she also pursued a minor field in musicology through the Eastman School of Music. Her academic training, musical background, and personal trajectory, and I should say that she's a classically trained pianist who grew up in Vienna, equips her with unusually useful tools to conduct fascinating research on the relationship between race, music, and national identity in Central Europe. She has published in German Studies Review, the Journal of World History, Opera Quarterly, and the Journal of the American Musicology Study. Her article, Black Venus, White Bayreuth, Race, Sexuality, and the Depoliticization of Wagner. I'm a French speaker, so please don't kill me. In post-war West Germany, which appeared in the German Studies Review in 2012, received 2 awards from the German Studies Association. She's currently at work on her first book, entitled Singing Like Germans, Black Musicians in the Land of Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms. And we're very lucky to have a preview, so to say, of that book in today's talk, which is called Hearing Race and Music in Communist East Germany, which is part of the Center for European Studies series, Conversations on Europe, but is also co-sponsored, I should say, by CREASE and its mini-series on minorities. So we're killing 2 birds with 1 precious stone, and we're very happy to have you here. So please join me in welcoming Kira Thurman.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. Is this on?
Yes.
Okay. I hope you can hear me all right. I'm pretty loud and brassy anyway, so it should come through. Okay, I'm going to put that there. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Thank you so much to the Weiser Center, the Center for European Studies, the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, the International Institute for hosting this, and to the German department as well for sponsoring this talk. I should probably explain why I'm here in some ways. I'm interested in sort of 2 different topics that occasionally converge. The first being the relationship between music and identity formation in Central European history. How and why did Germans come to see themselves as the land of Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms? Why is it that organized sounds, music, have been involved in politics and cultural practices and values in Central Europe for so long? And then second, I'm also interested in understanding Central Europe's history of nationalism and racism. I want to know how the German-speaking regions have come to understand themselves in national and racial terms, and how the Black diaspora especially sort of functioned as a prism through which public conversations on race came to be filtered. So who gets to be a German is sort of one of my questions, and how have historical discourses on race and identity determined that? Although classes have just started, what my students and I have already been talking about in both of my classes so far is how the category of the nation state hasn't gone away. So Benedict Anderson and Eric Hobsbawm are sort of 2 of the authors that we've been talking about so far. And both of them, in different essays from the 1990s, remarked at the time in the 1990s that so many scholars really thought that the category of the nation state should have dissolved already as a unit of organization, as a method of historical analysis. They wrote their works in part because they were stunned by nationalism's immense power. And I wonder if that feeling is resurfacing again, and that we are again being stunned by nationalism's power in the year 2017. If the recent years leading up to sort of about maybe 2015 or so were about our history of globalization and interconnectedness, about increasing international cooperation, the year 2016 feels sort of like a rejection of these ideals. So I think that's sort of one of the reasons why I'm here today. I'm here to sort of bring my musical analysis and cultural focus on the East German past to help us think about sort of what went down politically in Germany in 2016. In many of the big state elections last year, the racist, anti-immigrant, nationalist far-right party Alternative für Deutschland, or Alternative for Germany, or AfD, I'll just sort of call it for short, won big enough percentages of the vote to enter state parliaments. And where the AfD party, this party, was at its strongest, a lot of people observed, was in former communist East Germany. In Saxony, in March 2016, the CDU party, the Conservative Party of Angela Merkel, won first place with 29% of the vote, and the AfD came in second with 24%. It's the blue column over there on the right. In September 2016, in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, the SPD won 30% of the vote, the Social Democrats, and the AfD came in at 20% of the vote. And from this map, you can tell that the regions sort of closer to the east voted more for the AfD than to the west, where a lot of people are close to Hamburg in particular. It was the first time ever that the CDU, the Conservative Party, had lost to a far-right party. And in Berlin, the AfD captured 14% of the vote. And the map also reveals where the AfD had their strongest base in parts of former East Germany, East Berlin on the right. If you've been following politics and culture in contemporary Germany, a lot of what I'm saying right now perhaps is unsurprising to you. In 2014, the Washington Post partnered with the German newspaper Die Zeit to publish a series of fascinating sort of maps and images showing the deep social and ideological divisions that still exist between East and West. So there are disparities they observed in income, as you can see here, in unemployment, in demographics, that more young people sort of live in the West than in the East. But what people find especially fascinating are the next two sort of graphs or maps I'm going to show. The first one being the number of foreigners in East Germany, which is not that high in comparison to the West. But then here's sort of the map depicting the success of the far-right sort of nationalist parties. In this case, the NPD from a while back, but now you could sort of add the AfD into the mix as well. So there is this disconnect, in other words, in East Germany between the number of immigrants who live there and the deep hostility towards them politically embodied by the NPD. So there is now, in the year 2017, a popular representation of East Germany as the hotbed of neo-Nazism, racism, and xenophobia. And there's a narrative of East German history that undergirds this as well, which goes something like this. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, East Germans, sort of poorly integrated into an increasingly multicultural German society, and encountering immigrants for the first time, were and remain unable to cope with ethnic difference. Ignorant and uneducated as a result of their extreme isolation during the Cold War, they have been left behind as contemporary cosmopolitan Germany marches ever forward down the road to international cooperation, the EU, and globalization. This narrative should make us a bit uncomfortable, though. On the one hand, yes, it's clear that people have organized in East Germany and rallied around extreme nationalism, xenophobia, and racism in a manner that seems unprecedented in post-World War II German history. But the AfD also has a foothold in West Germany. It won 15% of the vote in Baden-Württemberg, for example, more than in Berlin. As you can see here as well, it's again the blue on the right. So I fear that what public and international fixation on East German racism might potentially do is absolve West Germans from their own racist or anti-immigrant actions. So it becomes a matter of sort of saying, well, we're not the problem, in other words, it's those East Germans. Second, what historians and other scholars are pointing out these days is the false construction of the narrative itself. East Germany, before and after the fall of the wall, was host to many immigrants from around the world. like Karamba Diaby here, for example, who was born in Senegal and immigrated to communist East Germany in 1985. He became the first black member of German parliament in 2013 and is a member of the SPD party in Saxony-Anhalt or Sachsen-Anhalt. If there is a particularly East German history of race and migration, and if there's a particularly East German story of racism here in particular, then sort of what is it, I think, is becoming the question. How might East German's racial past relate to its racial present? So for this presentation today, I'm going to think about these questions by pondering the lives and careers of two African-American performers, Paul Robeson and Aubrey Pankey, who performed and lived in communist East Germany in the 1960s and 70s. One loved and adored, Paul Robeson, the other greatly distrusted, Aubrey Pankey, throughout their careers. Their stories tell us how East Germans worked out their ideas of race, nation, music, and belonging before the fall of the Berlin Wall. What East German audiences desired from both performers, I will argue later, was a certain kind of ethnic authenticity and a performance of blackness that fit with their Marxist-Leninist worldview. So in order to get into that, what I'm going to talk about for a minute, sort of for context, is sort of East Germans' understanding of music and East Germans' understanding of sort of race and international solidarity before turning over to their two specific case studies. So music. Formed out of the ruins of World War II, the German Democratic Republic ascribed great significance to historical narratives as a way to legitimize their claims that they were a strong, independent nation state. Moreover, because East Germany was insecure about its claims to political legitimacy, the communist SED party, the sort of main party in control, from the beginning relied on culture to bolster its claims that the GDR was the real Germany. And music, of course, played an essential role in East German nation building. East German officials, for example, led a public campaign for the quick creation of a national anthem in the immediate post-war years, which was commissioned by 1949. And I think you can see the name sort of Hans Eisler in particular, sort of one of the main people involved in this. So the East German state understood that the national anthem was going to be sung in schools, at soccer matches, at official government ceremonies, and in youth camps. So they made sure they had a national anthem even before they had a national flag. GDR officials believed that musical performances could unify communities, and that an accessible, melodic, and memorable anthem had the potential to consecrate the foundation of their newly formed state. The SED party also worked hard to cultivate an image of the GDR as the exclusive heir to the Austro-German musical tradition, that they were the true land of classical music, of Bach, of Beethoven, and Brahms. So historical figures, in their sort of rewriting of these narratives, historical figures such as Ludwig van Beethoven became critical musical ancestors to East Germany, helping East Germans historicize their own national identity through music. So as early as 1946, members of the SED party touted Beethoven as a national hero, a socialist revolutionary whose fiery music foreshadowed the creation of their glorious East German state. The composer Johann Sebastian Bach became a proto-revolutionary, Beethoven a fighter against the aristocracy, and Wagner a champion of socialist revolutionary ideals. In addition to positioning themselves as the rightful inheritors of German musical culture, East Germans also frequently claimed that, unlike West Germany, they were the only German-speaking state that had eliminated racism, or had at least maimed it, in their communist, anti-capitalist, and anti-fascist society. They were the good guys, protesting the racist practice of segregation in the United States, supporting African nations' quest for political and economic independence from the European oppressors, and calling for an international brotherhood of racial equals in the name of communism. And we see here this really striking visual account of this international stance in the form of a sort of triptych from December 1961 called Socialism Wins. The work contains 3 separate horizontal frames, each depicting people either fighting on behalf of the socialist cause or benefiting from it. One section of the painting includes a series of sort of happy brown people on the top, living in harmony in a warm tropical location, now free to live peacefully thanks to socialism, which had removed the chains of colonialism. African Americans were especially important to the state's legitimization, and they were regularly appropriated into political narratives that promoted East German visions of a classless post-colonial society. The state encouraged teachers to educate students on the history of African American slavery in order to remind citizens of the evils of capitalism and the struggles Black Americans still face to overcome institutionalized racism. The GDR published volumes of African American poetry and literature by writers such as Richard Wright and Langston Hughes. In addition to publishing memoirs by Paul Robeson and tracts by W.E.B. Du Bois, they hosted numerous African Americans in their state as well, including Angela Davis and Martin Luther King Jr., and an ancient W.E.B. Du Bois at age 90 also visited. But in spite of their claims that they were a state that was ideologically committed to expunging racism through their commitment to socialism, my research shows that problematic constructs of Blackness persisted in their socialist anti-racist state. A difference emerged between the articulate and oftentimes really sincere ideological anti-racism espoused by the state and the cultural racism that existed on the ground. So we will see today how much East German listeners believed in romanticized notions of African American musicians that were sometimes divorced from the realities African Americans experienced in the latter half of the 20th century. East Germans perpetuated myths of African American musicality and authenticity that fit with their own pre-existing Marxist tropes, ones that envisioned African American laborers toiling away on cotton fields in the Deep South, whose soulful music stemmed from the soil, from hard labor, from charismatic Black churches, and from a primitive upbringing along the Mississippi. An example of how problematic views on race plagued East German musical culture is the first ever full-scale European production of George Gershwin's famous opera Porgy and Bess. And this is a subject of a future article, so if we want to talk about it afterwards, I'd love to sort of get into a little bit more. So prior to the Komische Oper's premiere of the work in January 1970, all productions of Porgy and Bess in Europe had been American tours with American casts sponsored by the United States sort of State Department. But the Komische Oper's production was entirely German-led in its initiative and in its production, staffing, and staging. And the Komische Oper stated that they wanted to produce this opera to musically express solidarity with those suffering from oppression, seeing African American victimization as a result of capitalism. So the Komische Oper, led by Götz Friedrich, who was a prominent opera director at the time, took on a controversial opera that even some American opera houses wouldn't touch. But they forgot about racist power. They misunderstood or underestimated how much race and Black American culture were central to the performance and reception of this work. However much they wanted race to disappear or for it not to matter, race ended up coloring, pun intended, the politicized production they wanted to stage. After agreeing to take on Gershwin's Negro opera, deciding to translate the work into the vernacular, they translated it into a sort of Sächsisches German, apparently, which is sort of fun to think about. One of the first questions emerged among the production staff itself was how to portray the characters. Should we use blackface was a question that the opera house debated. They decided against using traditional blackface and instead sort of smeared themselves in a coppery brownish tint on the cast. You can kind of see it in this image. It was sort of the best one I could find, other than my newspaper articles where it's not as clear. But that still was not satisfactory. So throughout the many months that the show went on, the Opera House hired different African Americans to perform the two lead roles of Porgy and Bess. So was these musicians' skin color providing an ethnic authenticity to this musical performance? Regardless, the show was one of the most popular productions in East Berlin that year and was sold out for its entire run. And although critics praised director Goetz-Friedrich for not distracting, their words, his viewers with the question of race, which they called of secondary importance, and instead keeping their gaze on what really mattered, which was capitalist oppression, nearly all reviews I've read focused on the perceived authentic blackness of the opera and its performers. Race was an inescapable, unshakable element to this production and its reception. The same year, this is a side note, the Commercial Opera also staged Fiddler on the Roof, which I'm really curious about, sort of thinking about how they were able to sort of stage that musical in particular. So we could perhaps also talk about that afterwards. So contradictions between the claims of anti-racism and the realities of sort of cultural exchange and interaction on the ground are especially noticeable in the careers of Paul Robeson and Aubrey Pankey. So to begin with Paul Robeson, arguably the most famous black musician to travel through communist East Germany, Paul Robeson visited in October 1960 to receive the Peace Medal from the East German state. Robeson, as many of you probably already know, had been a committed socialist for some time, after a visit to a small Welsh mining community in the United Kingdom deeply affected his political consciousness. To him, the African-American struggle against racism, discrimination, and economic oppression could be won by throwing off the chains of capitalism and racist Western imperialism, theories and philosophies rooted in the works of Marx and Lenin. In fact, for Robeson, his first visit to the USSR in 1934 proved to be a life-altering event. During his visit, he said, quote, "Here, I am not a Negro, but a human being for the first time in my life. Here, I walk in full human dignity." When he visited East Germany in 1960, Robeson greatly enjoyed his stay, and he spoke fondly years later of the people he encountered there. But what did East Germans make of Robeson? In promoting Robeson as an international friend of their socialist state, they also ended up fixating on his race in ways that belied their own state interests. Both the cultural ministry in charge of his tour and the East German press promoting Robeson, who was 6'3" tall, he's sort of really tall, they sort of promoted him as this jolly BFG, I call him, big friendly giant or black friendly giant, and a concert singer dedicated to soulfully singing the songs of his people from America and Africa. They rolled out the red carpet for their black brother, building him a special big bed for the duration of his stay, and assigning him a private doctor and bodyguard who was shorter than Robeson, but jokingly said he could still leap in front of Robeson's heart. Right. They portrayed him sort of constantly smiling, laughing, and dancing, quote, with the rhythm of African folk tunes with locals. And a photo app for the press arranged by the Culture Ministry, I think this is the image in the middle, shows Robeson with a small white 8-year-old girl named Anka who begs him to stay. The large image in newspapers of Robeson with the small girl demonstrates contrast between the giant black Negro singer and the innocent child, and the headline simply reads, "Paul Robeson, your big black friend." Right. And the third image on the left is him dancing with African students who were studying at the University of Leipzig. They also employed the narrative of slavery in creating empathy for Robeson and his people's plight. For example, at the ceremony awarding him the Peace Prize, in addition to an honorary doctorate from Humboldt University, Humboldt professors sang in full regalia an arrangement of the 19th century abolitionist song, John Brown's Body, in honor of him. And after listening to Robeson give a recital and sing his famous number, Old Man River, at the end of the evening's festivities, critics praised his dark, booming voice and commented that his rendition of African-American music perfectly captured the struggles against capitalism. So, quote, "Melancholy, sadness, and restrained rage against the white robber are typical characteristics of Negro songs and poetry," one listener wrote after hearing his performance. So for all of East German's attempts to establish a distinctly humane, anti-racist discourse surrounding Robeson, they ultimately fell back on well-worn stereotypes that resonated with their Marxist interpretation about African-American culture and music. Listeners praised Robeson's ethnically authentic musical performance for its perceived inherent socialist message, while also praising it for its exotic differences. that separated it from the German music of Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms. And because Robeson embraced and disseminated the beliefs that the GDR avowed, sort of confirming their own self-understanding, the GDR in turn honored and loved Paul Robeson. So Aubrey Pankey. Unlike Paul Robeson, Aubrey Pankey had a different experience as an African-American musician in East Germany. As a classically trained baritone who specialized in singing German Lieder, German art songs, Pankey experienced difficulties gaining acceptance from East German listeners, who repeatedly expressed their discomfort with Pankey as a practitioner of German musical culture, their culture. Aubrey Pankey originally traveled to Europe in the 1930s. His is a really fascinating story. He studied voice at the University of Vienna's Musikhochschule in 1931. In November of that year, Pankey hosted a traditional Liederabend, or sort of a recital of German art songs, where he sang numerous German Lieder, and critics praised him for singing these Lieder like a German. Quote, and this is the quote you can see here, quote, "A black man," one critic wrote, "who sings Schubert and Richard Strauss with overwhelming intensity of feeling and forms them into great unforgettable experiences. He is a boon for our period, where one is very easily inclined to see in all Negro musicians mere jazz band clowns. There are evidently black men who are messengers of culture at its greatest." So as a classically trained singer, Pankey embodied the positive, sort of universalist ideals of German classical music. Pankey, like Robeson, was a committed socialist. And following World War II, he spent considerable time in communist Hungary and Czechoslovakia before pleading asylum in East Germany in 1955, where he lived until his death in 1971. He was also an outspoken critic against racial stereotyping, which led him to speak out on two separate cases of racism in East Germany. In 1958, he wrote a letter to Gerhard Eisler, a leading figure in GDR cultural politics, expressing his outrage that the Staatsoper, sort of the main opera house in Berlin, had given him this speaking role of Negro preacher in a cantata that they were to perform together. He wrote that he could not accept this role assigned to him because, quote, "the invitation was extended to me not because I am a singer or an American, but strictly because I am a Negro." Pankey objected to the notion that his skin color could provide authenticity to, and as a result perhaps legitimize, a musical performance on an East German stage. In February 1961, Pankey again found himself at odds with the East German musical community and wrote to protest his treatment as an African-American musician living in East Germany. After hearing Pankey give a sort of German art song recital in Rostock, the local music critic published an article critical of Pankey's performance, saying that he did not understand why Pankey had sung so many German songs. Pankey, the critic writes, was ill-suited to perform German music. He fundamentally lacked the language skills, intonation, expressive qualities, and cultural heritage required to carry the weight and significance of this music. It was altogether quite strange for this Negro artist to orient his program around German music, considering his obvious racial background, the critic wrote. Why hadn't he just performed spirituals and African-American music instead? On February 28, 1961, Aubrey Pankey responded in a letter he hoped would be published in the local newspaper and that he circulated in the culture ministry. It's in German, but I'm going to read sort of large chunks of it in English. Quote, "Had the critic constricted his criticisms to my voice, to my interpretation and technique, there would be no reason for this letter," Pankey complained. "But," he continued, "your reporter has assigned himself the task of politically analyzing my concert program. His ideas regarding my political and cultural obligations to my people are simply racist in their effect." Pankey continued, quote, "I consider it a serious political problem when a music critic of the GDR blows the horn of white chauvinism. They are the ones who ask Negro singers to concentrate on singing spirituals. This is the attitude your commentator takes on. He might have other reasons for it, but the result is the same. As a musician who had trained and performed in Vienna and Salzburg in the 1930s, Pankey defended his right to perform German music. That freedom to sing German music, Pankey argued, should exist above all in East Germany, a state that understood African American struggles against oppression and supported equal rights, freedom, and peace. Pankey's words. What makes Pankey's case important for my research is that it exposes a set of miscommunications, misunderstandings, and misconceptions between Blacks living, working, or traveling to East Germany and the listeners who received them. Aubrey Pankey highlights, in a way that Paul Robeson could not, the conflict between abstract notions of African American identity and the local encounters that threaten to undo these constructs and dispel them as myths. Aubrey Pankey's performance of German Lieder illuminate ultimately sort of two different levels of thinking at work: the socialist anti-racism that the state promoted, and the ongoing depictions of African American identity sort of rooted in the pre-1945 era. Pankey makes it possible for us to see how difficult it was for Musikfreunde, sort of the friends of music, who thought that they were being racially welcoming, to see outside their own worldview. Pankey, a musician committed to building socialism and fighting against racism, used the language of the East German state, language that he believed in, to encourage the people he encountered to rethink their own racial and musical understandings. So, conclusion. I'll end with thinking about this person. His name was George Bird. He was a conductor, an African-American conductor, who performed frequently in East Germany from the 1950s until after the Berlin Wall fell, actually. So in March 1959, on the 216th anniversary of the Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra, that's the orchestra of Felix Mendelssohn, African-American conductor George Bird made his debut with the orchestra to a sold-out and adoring crowd. And the main music critic for the Leipziger Volkszeitung, a sort of East German newspaper, made some fascinating and possibly profound observations about Black musicality and its possibilities in East Germany. The critic argued in part that these sorts of performances are exactly what East Germany welcomes, because they prove in a positive sense what East Germany has to offer different races in a way that West Germany could not. Marveling that on the anniversary of the Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra's first concert ever, it now hosts an African-American conductor, he reflects, quote, just 20 years ago, sort of World War II, just 20 years ago, something like this would have been inconceivable. People filled with racial hatred would have made such a guest performance impossible, just like when they chased Gewandhaus Kapellmeister Bruno Walter away because he was a Jew. In the United States and in other capitalist countries, the critic argues, African Americans are limited musically in what they can do. They are reduced to playing in jazz bands or performing popular music because American racism refuses to see them as capable of doing anything else. Yet, he insists, and this is a quote here, quote, at the 16th Gewandhaus concert, George Bird proved what high musicality the Negro possesses in interpreting classical music from European nations. This high musicality can only let us guess what other achievements we can expect from Negroes once their full equality exists, not just on paper in the USA, and once other oppressed countries in Africa have ultimately freed themselves from colonial slavery. The East German state, then, offered a tantalizing future for Black talent and for oppressed peoples everywhere. Here, the critic suggests, could Black people finally be free to perform not just what's expected of them, jazz, but also whatever is their heart's desire? I have to confess that I think about this quote a lot. Was East Germany truly the land of musical and racial freedom? I, like East German music critics, struggle with this tension between the high-minded internationalism of many East Germans and the realities of race for minorities in daily life. I know that although publicly embracing the foreign nationals who had immigrated to East Germany, and by the fall of the wall there are about 200,000, the East German state still had difficulties acknowledging that foreign workers were frequent targets of violence in their state. As late as 1989, the SED party celebrated their rainbow of ethnic minorities from Angola, Algeria, Cuba, Mozambique, and sort of Asian countries as well, like Vietnam and China, while continually barring marriages between foreign workers and East German citizens, for example. East German voices sang loudly and confidently the same song throughout GDR history, the song of international solidarity, anti-imperialism, and anti-racism. Yet when acts of racism occurred leading up to the fall of the Berlin Wall, what racial minorities heard the most were not the songs of solidarity, but the sound of silence. Thank you.
So we have time for questions, and Zana or Julie? What we will ask, because this lecture is being taped, in order to have you on tape, you need to speak to a microphone. So if you can, we'll take a cue, and basically we'll bring a microphone to you.
Thank you for this excellent lecture. My question goes back to, excuse me, the very beginning of your speech, and you talked about the GDR trying to use, I believe it was Beethoven, Bach, and Wagner, as political heroes or whatever in socialism. Excuse my ignorance, but do you know what were their political leanings at the time? Was there any basis for that, or was that all propaganda?
Sure. Do you mean what were the political leanings of the composers at the time? Am I on? Am I still, can you hear me? Okay. So there's this really great book, if you want to read it, called Beethoven in German Politics by David Dennis. And it has a whole chapter on Beethoven in East Germany, or sort of reception of Beethoven in East Germany. He obviously did not live then. Right. And the thing that's really fascinating about Beethoven, and this is sort of the introduction to the text as well, is that Beethoven in his lifetime was really contradictory. He was at one point sort of someone in favor of the aristocracy. At one point he was against them. At one point he was a revolutionary. At one point he's an anti-revolutionary during the French Revolution. So he's all of these things, but not one of them. And so over time in the 19th and 20th centuries, because he sort of is so contradictory, different East German political actors can use him for whatever their purpose is. The way in which they sort of, mentally tap dance around Bach is really fascinating, considering that he's a sort of staunch Lutheran composer, as well as Handel is sort of another figure in it. That his music, it sort of suggests a sort of egalitarianism itself through counterpoint and things like that. So these are the sort of musical arguments they make. And same for Wagner, who does have a history of being both revolutionary, participating in the 1848 revolutions, but then anti-revolutionary and sort of being in favor of the monarchy and things like that. So they could use them however they wanted, I guess, might be the answer to that. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for the wonderful talk. You actually ended with exactly just the answer you just gave, ended with the question I wanted to ask, which was about Richard Wagner and his anti-Semitic leanings. And he was Hitler's favorite composer.
Yeah.
Was there any kind of self-reflection on behalf of the GDR's government and about who they lauded as, who they wanted to elevate as heroes of German history and music?
So there's another really great article I can recommend, which is by Elaine Kelly. Elaine spelled with an E at the end. She's a professor at the University of Edinburgh, and she has a really fascinating article on, I think she calls it the Janus-faced head of Richard Wagner in the GDR, which in short is that they sort of swept all that under the rug, right? They sort of completely sort of dismissed all of that, and instead found ways. I mean, it's not until the 1970s really that they sort of rehabilitate Wagner. And try to figure out how they can sort of present him in a way that aligns with the GDR, with their state aesthetics and musical vision.
And he still performed.
Oh yeah.
So it's not like he's been annexed and his operas sell out every time. So.
Right. Yeah. But the question of what do you do with a composer like Wagner in the post-war period is a really interesting question in general, and that both East and West Germany struggle with this a lot. Yeah.
Hi, I just was thinking in what you were just saying, there was this old saying that the GDR flushed its Nazi past down the West German drain.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it's, I lived and taught at various gymnasien all over Germany in the 1970s, which brings me, I'm sorry I'm making comments, but with the whole thing that struck me with putting Porgy and Bess on, in my looking at it, it supports something that I continually ran into in teaching there, which in the 1980s and 90s in the textbooks was totally changed, partially because I got mad at Klett Verlag. But the thing that would happen is if you looked in the books, and Porgy and Bess would be this way, this whole idea that American blacks were all deprived. Very often you'd have a picture of a mammy sitting on the stoop with her 4 kids. And what I would do would be go up to Hamburg or someplace, and I would get Ebony magazine,
Oh, neat.
and I would
wow.
show it to the students and everything, and there was always this sputtering because of this underlying thing there. And then they'd say, but, they looked like whites, only they were black, and a whole range of things there that was not realized. And it wasn't because what was put there was untrue, but it was selected out. And that's why in looking at the same thing in East Germany, I don't know, I didn't work with their textbooks back. Well, I did too, as a matter of fact. But the same kind of thing was going there of emphasizing the poverty and all of the rest of the blacks, also the Indians, which didn't give the people the idea. And that's what's still, I mean, as I say in the textbooks, they began to change in the 80s and 90s, and it's not there anymore.
So I think, thank you for that comment. That this is sort of, and this is another essay for anyone who's interested by Sarah Lennox on sort of GDR reception of African American literature in particular. That the literature they like best, the literature that they're going to publish, is literature that suits their sort of worldview. So they're big fans of Richard Wright and Langston Hughes, but then other writers not so much. And so I think this speaks to the whole thing about sort of needing this narrative of victimization of sort of African American history and African American culture in order to sort of celebrate the East German state.
This is somewhat connected to that. So one thing that was very interesting to me was just seeing the difference in perception and treatment between Audrey and Paul Robeson, and the nuance there in terms of like their performances of blackness. It kind of reminded me of like how in the United States, like African Americans, descendants of slaves, and there are different narratives attached to African immigrants. Is that similar, or were there any like, or could you describe if there were any like nuances or differences between perceptions and narratives and discussions around American-born black folk and like black folk from Europe and Germany in particular?
I love that question very much. And I think you're touching on something really fascinating, which is, and I think this is becoming a subject of interest in general. So how does Germany, but also how did Europe in general understand the complexities of the black diaspora, right? Are there, what are moments where we see sort of clear recognition of cultural differences? What are moments of sort of lumping together? If they are lumping together, is it in the name of something like Pan-Africanism and they're supporting it? Or is it because they can't tell the damn difference between sort of different kinds of black people? And in the East German state, I mean, there is a really strong sense, especially by the 1970s, of sort of African American culture with the rise of, especially sort of figures like Angela Davis, who becomes really popular, and that there is this hierarchy. Perhaps this is the other sort of part of it, is that there is a sense of hierarchy, that African Americans or American blacks are ranked higher in social status than a lot of Africans who come over to study at university or who are on guest worker visas or things like that. But that's a really wonderful question, and I feel like that is a book. That is like a book someone needs to write. Not me right now, but maybe later. Yeah. Thanks.
Is this me? Okay. Hi, Kira. Everyone should read Kira's blog. It's awesome. Shakespearean gang signs. Sweet. My question's about the Musikfreunde and their critique of Aubrey Pankey and the idea that an African American shouldn't be singing this kind of music and interpreting it, right? my understanding is the Schubert and Schumann and the music, the poetry written by pretty famous poets, and then the settings. This is music from the Enlightenment, right? Which claims universal truths. Are they? So wouldn't everybody be, if it's a universal truth, shouldn't it be kind of open to everyone's interpretation? And so, do they address that at all? Are they defending that position at all, or are they just oblivious to the hypocrisy inherent in that?
That's such a wonderful question, and that is at the heart of my book. So at the heart of my book, I'm interested in this sort of romantic universalist belief that sort of music is a universal language, it belongs to all, everyone should be able to speak it, we are this universal brotherhood, so sort of all can rally around Mozart. But the reality is of sort of what starts happening when non-Europeans start espousing it? What starts happening when non-Europeans also start performing it? And do they also have the right to perform this music? And what I find is it's sort of a mix of both, of sort of acceptance and rejection, depending on the era, depending on the performer, and that there are sort of clever ways in which people sort of, what they'll say is this performance is not authentic, right? That's sort of the way that they sort of get into it is like, well, they don't have the cultural heritage. This is still a line used by the Vienna Philharmonic on why they don't accept Asian players, right? That they don't have the cultural heritage to perform German music, right? And that this is sort of how they explain to themselves what they're doing. So it's a long history, and it's a really fascinating one. So thank you for sort of raising that question. That's very much at the heart of this, is this tension between universalism, romantic universalism, and the realities, and the question of who has the right to actually perform this. Yeah.
Hi.
Oh, hi. Oh, sorry, hi.
You'd mentioned that Robeson had that he felt very welcomed in the USSR, and I was just wondering, based on the titles of various articles that were written about him, or the comments that were made that kind of highlighted like his size and his race and all whatnot, I just kind of wanted to know like what his response was to those things. I mean, if he was a proponent of socialism and agreed with the politics, then that's one thing. But clearly there were racist comments that were being made. But yeah, how did he feel about that?
He, like a lot of other African Americans who are going over, they say nothing. That in some ways, so going through his memoirs, I'm just like going through his memoir in my head right now, thinking about references to it. I should say as well, there are people who are very sincere in East Germany about welcoming Black musicians, about welcoming Black people, sort of other people into the East German state. So he does encounter people who are very warm and are very welcoming to him. So I don't want to discount that. I think the thing for a lot of African American performers is that Europe, for the longest time, well through the 1960s, 70s even, was this land of acceptance musically in a way that the United States was not. That there's this long history of institutionalized racism. There's this long history of African Americans not being able to perform in the Metropolitan Opera House in the States, right? Marian Anderson breaks the barrier in 1954. So what do you do if you're sort of an opera singer before 1954 and you want to perform? You end up in Europe. So they don't speak of their experiences, in part because I think, and I have examples going back to the 1870s of this, and in part because, they do see Europe as this land of racial acceptance, and perhaps oftentimes in interviews it's like a jab back at the States, like they accept me here in a way that America does not.
Thank you for this. This was fascinating. I was just wondering if you could say a little more about your sidebar about how the Opera House put on a production of Fiddler on the Roof. It's hard to kind of see that as like a Marxist fable, so I'm wondering how that worked and what the reception was compared to Porgy and Bess.
Yeah, so I'm still trying to figure that out too. I mean, it's so they put it on several times, like 1970, 1971, 1974. They put on Fiddler on the Roof. And you're right, I don't fully understand, in part because I haven't done the research yet on it, sort of how are they presenting Jewishness, right? Which is what sort of the musical in a lot of ways is about Jewish migration, so I don't know other than that they loved it. And I'm trying to figure out, yes, I think I'll have to just, later on when I have time, sort of go through different GDR newspapers to find out why. But I too am also curious. I too am really curious. Yeah. Whoa.
Shown regularly on TV, and there were several productions.
Okay. Yeah, there is a story here if someone would like to write it. So, yeah.
You've mentioned anti-Semitism has come up several times already. Could you say something about the status of Jews in East Germany during this period?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I wish I had my notes on me to sort of remind myself of some of it. I mean, I think in general what a lot of people have talked about is that, and this is perhaps how African Americans or sort of different minorities fit into the picture, as well as that what was more important than anti-Semitism, for example, in thinking about sort of Holocaust memorials in the post-war period, and the way in which concentration camps became a site of Holocaust memorials, that it was more important to emphasize communists and anti-fascist fighters, as they called them, as the victims of Nazism than Jews. Right, so that meant that they deliberately omitted, for example, the number of Jews killed in concentration camps at many different sites, Sachsenhausen, places like that. There are books out there now on sort of Jewish East German life and different sort of Jewish East German figures. I don't know that work as well, but I do know in some ways that this was something that the East German state also struggled with. Perhaps things like the show trials, which were happening in Eastern Europe, as well as in East Germany, might be another example of that. The famous Paul Merker trial, where someone is sort of accused of Zionism and things like that. Paul Merker in the 1950s is another example of that. But I think the question of the 1960s and 70s is an interesting one, of sort of what is life like for Jewish Germans in East Germany. Yeah.
Sorry to make you run. You began with the contemporary moment,
Yeah.
and the politics of nationalism and xenophobia in East Germany now. And I'm just wondering maybe if you can talk about music in East Germany in the contemporary moment, especially as it relates to race, given the heaviness of the politics right now.
Right. That is a big question. I'm trying to figure out how to, maybe like by which genre of music do I tackle first, if it's classical music or if it's other forms. Another name I can recommend is an ethnomusicologist named Alison Furlong, who's writing a lot right now about music and neo-Nazism in East Germany, and trying to figure out what kinds of musical genres are neo-Nazis sort of being drawn to. She does really incredible work in that she goes and she interviews neo-Nazis, which is terrifying to me, sort of the thought of going and interviewing them and asking them about their musical preferences and what are they listening to these days. And she does a lot to talk about the role of punk, which changes, because punk actually was used to protest against the East German state in the late 80s, and how that then becomes something that gets co-opted by the far right to sort of become music that they use. So she followed around different neo-Nazi punk bands, metal bands, things like that, heavy metal, those kinds of genres. The issue of sort of race and classical music in East Germany, at this point I would sort of expand it more broadly to sort of all of Germany, and the ways in which Germany is still very welcoming and accepting of African-American opera singers and musicians, that they still get more gigs in Europe than they do in the States, but that there are still a lot of problems, that blackface is a regular occurrence in German opera houses all the time, things like that, and sort of staging practices are also very problematic today. So.
No more questions?
Sure.
Thank you so much for
Oopsie. Yeah.
your talk and
Yeah.
for coming. We look forward to the book.
Okay, sure. Me too. Thanks. Thanks.